I'm going to talk today about doing the impossible. It's something that happens a lot in DEF CON in particular. Somebody says something's impossible, then a clever hacker comes up with a way to do it. And the question is, how do you do that? Because I know there's a lot of aspiring hackers here, which I think is really awesome. But as it turns out, there's a lot of patterns. There's a way you can think about problems that helps you identify what the reason is other people think it's impossible and how you can be clever and get around it. And I'm going to start talking about space. Space is awesome, right? And you might ask the question of how much does it cost to get 1 kilogram from here to orbit, so low Earth orbit, which is what a lot of satellites use. You might say that costs a ton of money. And as it turns out, it does cost a lot of money. To take 1 kilogram to orbit on the space shuttle costs $18,000 for just 1 kilogram. That's not a lot. Basically your Chromebook. And then other rockets, you have the Delta IV Heavy is close to $9,000, $9,800. Still extremely expensive. And then new rockets, Atlas V could get down to $6,200. This is still really expensive. You can see we're getting lower and lower in cost, but we're really not doing very well. The Chinese, they have a rocket that can do $4,100. And then a company called SpaceX, you may have heard of them, they can do about $3,800. So the price is going lower. And probably one of the lowest cost rockets, the Russians have a rocket that can get 1 kilogram to space for $3,200. And so if you were a monkey and you really didn't think too hard about this, you might say it's really expensive to get stuff to space. We're never really going to go below $1,000. All these smart people have tried. You might go give up and go do something else. But I'm going to challenge you to ask the question of, well, how do rockets actually work? You might say, here's an example rocket. It's a Falcon 9, and it costs about $50 million. It's a ton of money, but it can lift quite a lot of matter to space. And you might ask the question, well, where's all that money going? $50 million is a ton of money. Maybe it's the fuel, maybe it's the actual rocket itself. And so when you look at it, the fuel is only about $200,000 of that rocket. And that actually turns out to about $15 a kilogram, which is actually, that's not that much compared to the several $1,000s a kilogram that you've seen before. And so now the question is, instead of saying, oh, it's impossible to get cheap flights to space, you can say, well, okay, now that we know the fuel, which you're not going to get rid of, only costs $15 a kilogram, well, how do we get it down from $3,800 a kilogram to maybe under $1,000, maybe even $500 a kilogram? Every time you launch this rocket, you're throwing away this expensive rocket. They don't reuse them. And so this company, SpaceX, they had a clever idea to say, hey, what if we can reuse these rockets? And I'm going to show you a video. And this is a prototype of one of their rockets that can actually go up in space, or sort of go up in the air and land. So that's pretty cool. They essentially shot a rocket up, and it's like balancing a horse on the head of a pin, and then brought it back down intact. And the reason they spent all the time trying to do such a very hard problem is they found that the cost of the rocket is really the key problem you can solve. If you can solve that, you can bring the cost of spaceflight right down. So they're actually going to be able to get, with this, if they're able to get the reusable technology, down to $500 a kilogram to go to space. If they can reuse the rocket 1,000 times or more, they can be able to get it to $20 a kilogram to get up to space. I mean, can you imagine getting to space on $20 a kilogram. I mean, that's incredible. And it's all came from asking the question of what is the key problem we're trying to solve, and it's the cost of the rocket. But it turns out it's not just rockets. You'll see this all over the place. And actually, one of my favorite quotes from Einstein: "If I had 1 hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes finding the solution. If you face an impossible problem, spend the most of the time figuring out what the key thing you're trying to solve is, and everyone in this room is extremely clever. I guarantee you'll find the solution." And I'm going to talk about hacking phones. So this is something from my experience. So in 2004, this is the type of phone people had. This is a Nokia 6310i, black and white phone. It had Snake on it. It was an awesome game. Probably none of you remember this phone, but it was extremely popular. And if you could hack a phone over Bluetooth, you could send and receive text messages, you could read someone's phone book, and you could turn their phone into a bug. So you actually turn into a remote listening device. But every time we would find bugs in phones and try to disclose them to vendors and get them to fix them, they would say something to the effect of, well, it's impossible to use Bluetooth from more than 10 meters away. Nobody would ever hack phones. We're not going to fix it. And so they didn't fix it. And so basically every phone in the world was completely vulnerable, very, very easy to hack into. And nobody was going to do anything about it. And so the question is, well, one of the reasons they're saying you can't hack into phones is that the range is short. And it's possible to go longer. Well, how do we think about that? And I'd say, well, first you have to look at how radios work. So radios are wireless systems, and what you see here is you can think of a signal. The signal from a transmitter will be received at the receiver, and the signal decreases as you go further away. And the signal quality is a term called SNR, signal to noise ratio. And the further you get away, the smaller it is. And for a typical receiver, you need a certain amount of signal in order to be able to receive it. So you see this red line here is what a typical receiver is, and you can see that with a typical Bluetooth system with that much power, you might say the range is 40 meters. And so the question is, well, how do we extend the range? Most people say, well, it's impossible because that's what the data sheet says. It says, well, the range is 40 meters. You can't go further than that. But if you know how radios work, you can ask some interesting questions. So this is a group of people, Martin Herford, John Herring, James Burgess, myself, and Mike Outmaskeen, set out to answer this question. And we built something we call the Blue Sniper. And essentially we said, okay, let's take a really powerful radio and a really big antenna, and that can change how these things work. So you see this green line is when you add more power to the radio and a bigger antenna, you actually increase the power, and so the receiver still needs the same amount of power to receive it, but it can do it from much further away. And we ended up setting the world record from hacking a Bluetooth phone from 1.2 miles away. And this is something people said was impossible, but if you just think about how radios work, and adding more power and a bigger antenna was a really, really obvious way to solve the problem. Yet some of the smartest people in the world could not get over the range of Bluetooth is only 20 meters or 40 meters, and they never thought more than that. And you'll see this over and over again, right? All of the previous rocket companies before SpaceX not really thinking about the key problem being reusability of the launch vehicle and low cost. Same thing with Bluetooth. And I'm going to give another example, which is from the world of venture capital. So when a startup wants to get investment, they might go to investors and ask for money to help build their company. And some of the very successful venture capitalists in the world think about the world in a very similar way. So in 2007, myself and a few other people, we built a smartphone app to secure smartphones. And we talked to a lot of investors, and this is what the smartphone market looked like. 2007 to 2008, there were really 140 million smartphones sold in the world, which may seem like a lot, but compared to the billions of people on the planet, it's nothing. And if you projected that forward, you might say, okay, well, it's really not growing very fast, and in 2013, you'd only have maybe 240 million or 250 million smartphones in the world, which is still not very much. And so the majority of the people we talk to, their response when we say, hey, we have this idea, we want to build security for smartphones, they said, well, only executives use smartphones. No normal people use smartphones. And nobody downloads software, the market's tiny, I don't get it. And then we met a guy named Vinod Khosla. And the way the conversation with him went was we were halfway through our pitch, and he said, okay, stop, I've heard enough. We think, oh crap, he's going to say no, he's not going to get it. He said, okay, so what you're saying is you believe smartphones are now ready to become the dominant computing platform on the planet, and you want to build security for that. We're like, yeah. He says, okay, I'm in, what's the valuation? And you might say, wow, that's really fast that somebody just made a decision that quickly. And so we wanted to deconstruct, how did his brain work? How could somebody who saw all the same data as everyone else, why did he make a different decision than everyone else did? And so most people, they looked at this graph and said, smartphones will never be big. And it's easy to understand why, which is, these were the smartphones. They were really hard to use. You had the Motorola Razr up to the Windows Mobile smartphones. Even though the technology was getting better, people weren't really using them much more. And you might ask the question, well, why? Well, they were really hard to use. There were really no apps you could download. It was just not very pleasant. But in 2008, two big things happened. Number one is the first Android phone shipped. And number two is the iPhone 3G, which is the first iPhone to have the App Store. And so now all of a sudden, you had really similar technology that existed in previous ones, but it was really easy to use and really easy to download software. And those were two big changes. Even though the numbers didn't reflect it in 2008, it was obvious to Vinod in this case that, okay, this was going to change everything. You make something really easy to use, and this line will not be true. And as it turns out, that line was not true, because there were nearly 1 billion smartphones sold last year. And he didn't have any data, but when the fundamental assumption was the reason people don't use smartphones is they're hard to use, when that changed, then his assumption changed. Now we're in a world where nearly 25% of people have a smartphone today. And I think the key message that I have, if you take it away, is don't be a monkey. Understand how things work, and then really focus on defining the problems and understanding the problems even if you're faced with something impossible. And you'll do something that even extremely smart people who might have way more experience will miss. So that's all I have. Any questions? Yeah. So the question was, on the Bluetooth Sniper, how did we amplify the signal? What was the cost? So we used an off-the-shelf radio, so it was basically a fairly powerful radio, and then we used a 24 dB antenna, which you get for a couple $100. So it was really inexpensive. Probably all in we spent a few $100. Cool. Well, thanks a lot.